Dear colleagues, dear students and friends, welcome to the Sinophone Classicism lecture series. This is our last lecture before the summer break, to be continued in the winter semester with 3 further highly inspiring lectures. I'm honored today to introduce Professor Barbara Mittler from Heidelberg University, who is without doubt one of the most important German sinologists today. Professor Mittler began studying sinology in Oxford University and eventually received her PhD from Heidelberg in 1994. Her research expertise includes music, theater, media studies, and visual culture. In the last 3 decades, she has published 3 single-authored monographs. The first one is titled Dangerous Tunes, The Politics of Chinese Music in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the People's Republic of China since 1949, published in Wiesbaden in 1997. Second book, A Newspaper for China, Power, Identity, and Change in Shanghai's New Media, 1872 to 1912, by Harvard University in 2004. And the third book, and most importantly, A Continuous Revolution, Making Sense of Cultural Revolution Culture, published by Harvard in 2012, which won the John F. Fairbank Book Prize Award by the American Historical Association in 2013. She has also published a co-authored book with Thomas Meissen titled Why China Did Not Have a Renaissance and Why That Matters, an interdisciplinary dialogue in Berlin 2018. And she has published 11 edited volumes and numerous research essays. As I saw on your publication, there's 70-something. This is extremely productive. And she's currently working on a book on Chinese musicians on the global stage, among other projects. Aside from this very impressive publication list, as well as many prizes and awards, Barbara is also known as a generous colleague, a kind mentor, and a mother. Without even attempting to exhaust her multifaceted accomplishments, let me just say that I'm truly glad she has decided to contribute to our Sinophone Classicism lecture series with a very new research project. Today, Barbara will examine a composition written during the Omicron lockdown in Shanghai in spring 2022. It investigates, as it argues, and I quote, the unbroken power of dangerously harsh silence and the power of silent music as a means of protest in China's long history, end of quote. Recently, there are disturbing rumors that the Chinese government has ordered all levels of administration to destroy records related to the 3 years of zero COVID policy. Like many dark times in history, art has therefore assumed the power to preserve historical memory and speak the historical truth. I'm truly looking forward to the lecture. Dear Barbara, the floor is yours. Thank you.
I guess I'm a little shorter than the previous speaker. Thank you so much, Zhiyi, for this very kind introduction. The fact that I'm a mother has seldom been mentioned, and I'm a very happy mother of 2 very cute boys, musicians on the side, and therefore thank you for saying this. Now I begin with the lockdown. The composition that you mentioned will be there at the very, very end, but the lockdown will keep being with us. Throughout 2022, news from China kept circulating around the world, reporting that a few days of absolute still silence, demor, had been imposed in the city, or that the silence, demor, being a euphemism for lockdown. In late November, a wave of silent, wordless protests begins. The most important symbol used by the demonstrators from Beijing to Taipei is a blank sheet of paper, a reference to Mao. Just a few days later, on the 2nd of December 2022, China completely lifts its COVID restrictions from one day to the next. Why? What had happened? That's the question I want to explore by sharing with you some thoughts on Chinese protest cultures and their opponents. I'll talk about the power of silence, blank paper, and I will do so in order to think about what Zhiyi has called Sinophone Classicism. She says, in recent decades, highly heterogeneous literary and artistic articulations, harking back to China's classical past, gained increasing currency in the global Sinophone space and cyberspace. Zhiyi then proposes, instead of dismissing them as fetishisms, authenticating them as Chinese tradition, to use these Sinophone classicism as a new term, a new critical expression for conceptualizing a diverse array of articulations, referring to the appropriation, the redeployment, the reconfiguration of cultural memories, evoking Chinese aesthetic, intellectual traditions, and local, for the purpose of local, contemporary, and vernacular uses by different types of agents identified or self-identified as Chinese. This is a very useful concept, and in this paper, we'll therefore try to show that this particular type of Sinophone classicism is helpful to understand China, but I would like to extend its reach from in recent decades, actually, to basically China's long 20th century at least. Maybe we can even extend it. In her essay, Zhiyi proposes that the Sinophone classicism is a subjective, intimate, and reflexive way to experience an individual's culturally acquired Chineseness. It is temporal, mnemonic, and often mediated by the digital media. With her important essay, she joins recent scholarly efforts to dismantle the view of Chinese modernity as a monocentric, homogeneous experience by refocusing on classicism as a kind of anti-modern moderns. Indeed, and in my paper, I'm going to try take a view from the long 20th century on this idea of anti-modern moderns. I consider Sinophone classicism one important aspect of what I have termed a little differently the socialist modern. Something I've studied in 2021 with many others as well, looking back at the more than 100 years of socialism in China. It's this globally and classically informed modernism, which, as Zhiyi says, helps us to understand basically and to substantiate a post-Eurocentric turn in global academia, which I would add here has been significantly pushed by those who recognize the significance of, for example, the global Maoist or socialist 60s. Indeed, as Zhiyi says, Sinophone classicism is one important element in a future of global classicisms. And I think even as I go deeply into Chinese history now in the following minutes, you will see that actually there is a lot of it that can speak to global context. First, however, let me come back to silence. And the person I want to evoke is who wrote in about 100 years ago, on May 5th, 1925, the following sentence, and it is Lu Xun, one of the most important writers of Chinese modernism, who speaks about a China, or fears a China, warns of a China gone wordless, saying we should not be alarmed when we hear moaning, sighing, crying, or pleading. It's only when we're confronted by stark, explosive silence, 沉默, that we should be aware. For these announce the approach true breath. I'd already said it. It is the angry power of silences that I want to talk of today. The protest caught and contained in the silence will be the topic today. To this end, I would like to begin with a very quiet piece of music composed by Zhou Wenzhong, who is a Chinese composer who had gone to study in the US in the 1940s and then was unable to return to his own country after 1949 with the founding of the People's Republic of China, and thus became one, among other things, a student, a friend, and important composer in the circle of Edgar Varèse in New York, and later actually the manager of the estate of Edgar Varèse. Now, Zhu Wenzhong writes a piece that I want to play a bit from. So very silent. This piece is an example of the power of silence. It is written in a tradition inspired by ideas of Taoist philosopher Lao Tzu, who lived in the 6th century BC, and who has this idea that in the 5 sounds that define the Chinese musical system, the 5 sounds can actually make the ear deaf. Right? And consequently, in this understanding of sound art, the greatest sound, greatest tone dying, the greatest music is the one that is barely audible. It is a very delicate music, has a very delicate voice. And the instrument that can best play this barely audible music is the literati zither that you see here, the qin, literally ancient instrument and one of the oldest Chinese instruments from archaeological discoveries. It's a classic component in literati culture, and you will know it from Chinese landscape painting, where you will almost inevitably discover somewhere very small, under a tree or in a pavilion, as here, for example, a man with an instrument on his lap, the wuqin. And the instrument is flat like the earth, and here you can see the man in the pavilion, or they are actually at the riverside, and this instrument is flat like the earth at the bottom and curved like a sky on the top, and thus it represents our world in a miniature. And if you look even closer at these depictions, then you will realize that most of these instruments are actually instruments without strings, and therefore the music that can be played on these instruments is barely audible, as quiet as it can be. Great music. The piano composition by Zhu Wenzhong that we've just heard is basically recreating or rethinking this barely audible wuqin music. It is written as silent instrumental, one could thus say in European terms as absolute music. But as I will argue, not quite. For Chinese absolute instrumental music is characterized precisely not by the fact that it has no program, ideas behind it. It always has program or ideas behind it. The absolute instrumental music of the Occident is always primarily concerned with shaping specific purely musically determined worlds. The absolutely silent instrumental Chinese wuqin music, on the other hand, is in fact already through the construction, of course, of the instrument, evidently engaged in a dialogue with the world, between heaven and earth, so to speak. And therefore, it's always already about that world as well, that music being played there. What takes place in this music then, and from the music you can transfer this actually to many other art forms as well, is always already high politics. And the intense silence, the voids in this music and art are an expression of real rage, so to speak, with Shen. They are part of a culture of protest that goes back very, very in time. It goes back to something that you can already see in the great preface to the book or the classic of songs, where this is the oldest Chinese collection of ancient poems, folk songs, and others, songs in praise of rulers, and it sort of dates back from the 10th to the 7th century in its earliest parts. And there you can find, in the great preface, you can find this idea that song, poetry, or the arts more generally, are the product of earnest, heartfelt thought. And song and poetry and the arts more generally are thus an expression of everyone's innermost being, of people's desires, of their dreams, and accordingly, it is said that the sounds in the age of good order are peacefully, are joyful, and the government is then in harmony, whereas the sounds of the state in ruin or going to ruin are mournfully thoughtful, and the people are in these states in distress. So music is a direct way that is mirroring the state in which a society is in. And so wailing, sighing, crying, and begging, and finally anger, in other words, the mood of the people is reflected in the music of a country. So Chinese music, even in the form of absolute instrumental music, is thus song without words, but with words. If you want, important words, earnest, heartfelt thoughts, dreams, precisely because of this. So the overwriting or connection with a silent subtext, often indeed mostly a song of protest, even if this music speaks the language of silence. There's a beautiful anecdote that everyone in the Chinese universe, I would say, knows of Boya and Zhiyi, where one of these two friends just needed to play a piece on his guqin, and the other immediately knew what it was about. So one would play about water, and the other immediately heard what he meant and said, "Oh yes, water," etc. And then he played mountains, and then yes, mountains. And so from that comes the idea that the one who understands the sound of the other, the Zhiyi, is therefore in the Chinese context the best friend, right? The one who understands everything, even without saying. And music is thus potentially always kind of a secret language between such friends, between people who really, really understand each other. And just so you can hear what was behind the music by Zhiyi. On the strings, you heard that noise, and that's actually part of the music. It's part of these xisheng, of these sounds that you hardly hear, but you still hear them when they are recorded. Now, in the composition by Zhou Wenzhong that we heard at the beginning, is basically an evocation of on the piano of these very quiet sounds of the guqin, and this piece is called "The Willows Are New," and "The Willows Are New" is a poem, evokes a poem by Wang Wei, one of the greatest poets of the Tang. And this poem, even though it is but evoked and nowhere enunciated in the music itself, forms the semantic background, if you want, to this instrumental music, to its absolute music that's only seemingly absolute. In the composer's translation, the poem reads as follows: "In this town by the river, morning rain has cleared the light dust. Green, green around the tavern, the willows are new. Let us empty another cup of wine. For once west of Yangguan, the mountain pass, there will be no more friends." Wailing, sighing, crying, and begging, the guqin aesthetic which Zhou Wenzhong has reinvented for the piano can be read in the light of this poem as a protest song, a song without words. The poem by Wang Wei does not speak of simple goodbyes, this friend doesn't just go on a leisurely journey, not voluntarily does he go on this journey, but is an exile. In spite of the absoluteness, in spite of the silence, the wills are new, this peace is therefore peace that but conceals real anger, that tells of the bitterness and injustice of political regimes. It condemns people, a regime that condemns people like Zhou Enzhong himself, right, who is in exile, who is silenced in his own country. Even though, as absolute instrumental music, the piece only expresses this complaint rather quietly. The Wuqian in Zhou's piece appears as the kind of sympathetic, resonating body of a friend who has remained alone, who plays out his grief and connected to this, his rage, silence. That is silenced without words. Hearing and seeing. The Wuqian on the piano becomes an aid to this hearing and seeing. You don't need to play a lot of loud music, and yet you can still say very much in China. And what is it that Zhou Enzhong says, even if he says it quietly? The composition dates, as you have seen, to 1957, the time when, in the People's Republic of China, liberated by the communists, the so-called anti-rightist campaign, which had followed the 100 Flowers movement proclaimed by Mao Zedong in the previous year, during which China's citizens had been encouraged to criticize the party and its policies, only to be condemned and tortured for what they had said in the anti-rightist campaign following. So, and they were basically condemned for the very criticism that they were asked to raise with the party. Zhou Enzhong's play on the piano can thus be read as a silent critique of the Chinese Communist Party and its unpredictable and cruel politics, silent protest, if not entirely without words. He is, I would say, engaging in what Yang Zhiyi calls Sinophone Classicism. In his artistic articulations, he harks back to China's classical parts, thus finding a language to communicate in the global Sinophone space by redeploying, reconfiguring Chinese aesthetic and intellectual traditions for his own use. And he sort of identifies himself still as Chinese. And his intervention is, of course, part of a constant, if not the contemporary classicist surge that Yang Zhiyi explains is in the 1950s, but one that, of course, has become important since China's rise in economic and military power again. But one that was there already, as you can see here, in the 1950s, and I would argue actually even in this earlier period, Chinese intellectuals would make use of Sinophone classicism in order to engage in the secret language between friends. Yang describes aptly what is happening here. His silent song is one of these whispers to those who can decipher them. And what begins then is a kind of hermeneutic process that indeed at once creates a community of memory and of sentiment, as Yang Zhiyi puts it. Now, the significant silence in Chinese art and music constitutes in the eyes of the rulers what they call wild history. And this is why, and this is why they're afraid of it. In contrast, this wild history, the silent history that people don't express so clearly, it is, of course, opposed to correct, to orthodox history, so 正史. And it is the silence of unspoken dreams that expresses itself here, in which Lu Xun, who's saying at the beginning on silence as a harbinger of anger, I've discussed, has also an interesting thought about it. So speaking of dreams, he says, dream means freedom. To speak about a dream means no freedom. To dream is to dream of something real. To speak about a dream is inevitably to lie. And it's this dream and freedom potential of silent criticism that has always frightened Chinese rulers. At the very beginning of an ancient text from the time of the Warring States, we read that it is easier to dam a river than to silence the people. And if you look at how, and some of you probably have seen this, how the Weibo news about the lockdown in Shanghai in April last year, despite the constant deletion in the Chinese web and beyond the firewall, as wild history, how it kept disappearing, reappearing, and then finally became visible also and audible also on YouTube beyond the Chinese firewall. You understand that this old wisdom still plays a very, very important role today. We just play part of this video that, as I said, when silence was destroyed and came up again.
目前我们上海没有封城，现在也不必封城。基于当前上海的疫情形势，我们将根据区域风险，
咱们也就下定决心封上3、5天啊，封上1周不行吗？不行，为什么不行？因为上海，我们这个城市承载了不仅仅是上海人民自己的上海，我们这个城市还承载了在全国社会经济当中发挥了重要的功能。我想我们全部的上海市民应该有这样的大局观。
我现在告诉你一个事实，就是病房很紧张，隔离点没有房间，120没有车，这个是事实。现在嘛，让我通知人家阳性，健康云上嘛是个阴性，我们都让人家打1235投诉健康云，搞什么搞嘛？
现在连上海发布微博上面都关闭评论。
Obviously, the Chinese government didn't want this to be around. The fact that Chinese rulers continue to fear the voice of the people is one reason why Xi Jinping, by prescribing his orthodoxly formulated Chinese dream, forbids free dreaming like you should. And the reason why Chinese rulers so fear the voice of the people is also because they know that if they want to be good rulers, they are obliged actually to listen to this very voice of the people. For it is true that while a distinction was made between the right, correct, orthodox history, the Zhengshu, and the wild variants of it, the Yeshu, which corresponded to the quiet dreams of the people, and that while the ruler alone determined which kind of story was the right one, nevertheless, there was a right and an entitlement by the people to write these wild stories, i.e. to dream, to criticize freely. And this right has also been established in the Chinese political system for thousands of years. Now we go back again to the great preface of the classic of songs, from which I've already quoted before, where we read that those above, the superiors, can change those below, their inferiors, by using songs, and those below can criticize those above with these songs. Depending on the form in which such criticism is voiced, deceitful or remonstrating, that is, it would be free from reproach, and those hearing the criticism would take them seriously as admonition. This is very nice because feng, song, is also feng, to criticize. And so there's a wordplay with the homonymic use of this vocabulary, which in modern Chinese you would need to add a certain radical to make this into criticism, but in the classical that is not necessarily so. Now, what does that mean? A song, a poem, an artwork could have the purpose of instructing from top to bottom. That's to make the people into better people in the sense of the rulers, orthodox, right? But on the other hand, a song, a poem, an artwork could also be used by the people or by the officials, not just those officially designated as censors, but also the others within the political system to criticize those who ruled them, as was to happen in the 100 Hours movement at the behest of Mao Zedong, albeit with terrible outcomes, as we know, the anti-rightist campaign that caused the willows are new by Zhong. Now, a good ruler is characterized by the fact that he would keep open something that is called the 言路, the road of speech, right? And he was thus prepared to listen to criticism and remonstrating censors, unlike Mao had done in 1957. So the idea and practice of a complaint drum or bell, and that you can see actually in these early depictions, that would stand in front of a magistrate or in front of an emperor's big palace, right? This idea that you could come with your complaints and ring the bell or drum the drum and actually, make someone come out and listen to your complaints. You could report crises, you could admonish a ruler directly. This idea made its way from China to the world since the 7th century and served actually as a model for rulers and their image of the public sphere, allowing communication between those above and those below in Europe as well. So, and it is mentioned as late as by Jules Verne in his Tribulation d'un Chinois en Chine of 1879. But it actually, as I said, since the 7th century, and this is through first Islamic writings, it really moves to Europe, to India. Rudolf Wagner and Monika Juneja have worked extensively on this. In order to tap the potential of learning from critical songs, Imperial China, at least since the Hans, had established a special bureau, a special office, which engages in the collection of folk songs. It's called the hören, and in this sort of music bureau, really. Chinese ruler would collect these songs to learn about the state of their country, right? In the way that the great preface explains, to listen to the people's wailing, sighing, crying, and begging, to learn what they thought. Then again, to clean up those thoughts and to correct them, and thus to change, to transform. That's the most important sort of engagement the ruler has with its people, to change the people, always, of course, in the sense of the rulers, and in accordance with the tenets of orthodox and correct history, 正史. And one could argue even the Chinese government today engages in this kind of Sinophone Classicism because under Xi Jinping, for example, there are again such institutions which on the one hand collect folk songs and on the other hand are supposed to change the people with songs. They are called New Era Civilization Practice Centers, and they exist on all administrative levels in China. As you can see, what you can learn there, among other things, is on the right to sing. There you can learn how to sing proper songs, how to dance properly, how to interpret films properly. And then, of course, on the left, you have these tasks and arenas. What you're doing this for? You're doing this for the fact that you're then ideologically correctly oriented, that you have the right mainstream values, and you avoid, therefore, wild stories becoming too wild, right? So any unspoken free dreams cannot arise if you have this kind of didactic education. This is also the purpose of the very loud, orthodox, correct propaganda film productions that are called main melody films. So the 主旋律, the EP. And for good measure, they are called this way because they are supposed to set in sort of orthodox, the only one and only right tone, the right melody, which corresponds exactly to a particular version of correct history, and with which it is prescribed exactly how you have to speak, how you have to think, and how you have to dream. And many of these were produced recently, of course, in anticipation of the 100th anniversary celebrations of the Chinese Communist Party. And I just want to give you one example of this in English.
没有人可以掌握未来，我可以，
决心为共
因为年轻
奋斗终生，
就是未来。
中国共产党万岁！
没有人可以永远年轻，我可以，因为年轻的心永远年轻。年轻是一往无前， 直面一次又一次的失败，再比失败多一次的站起来。
胜利了！人民政府官，中央人民政府，今天胜利了！
未来有1万个问题，
算出来了，
我能给出10001个答案。
凡是符合招生条件的工人，
年轻
均可自愿报名。
是不信命，年轻是信自己。没有人能掐住我们，加油！加油！加油！不是相信成功，而是相信不会被打败。年轻本该如此，年轻从来如此。
青年是整个社会力量中最积极、最有生气的力量。国家的希望在青年，民族的未来在青年。
给王双左脚直。
一代又一代的相信，才有今天的自信。不被世界改变，才能改变世界。
我相信，
我
可以成为我相信的样子。
我是什么样子，中国就是什么样子。
我就是中国。
Ziemlich laut, quite loud. Such main melody films provide, and quite loudly as you've seen, the one and only accepted right tone, the right melody, which corresponds exactly to the version of Orthodox history that the ruling government wants, and in which it is prescribed exactly how one has to speak, to think, even to dream, as prescribed and established, for example, in what has come to be called under the communists the resolutions of questions of Chinese history, most recently promulgated in 2021 by Xi Jinping after 1949 under Mao Zedong and 1981 under Deng Xiaoping. Sinophone Classicism, these can be considered as new and prescriptive dynastic histories as they validate past regimes, another form of government Sinophone Classicism. In any case, if one dares to criticize this version of history and the main melodies and prescribed bespoken dreams of lies that Liu Xun speaks of, then it can become quite dangerous. This is evident if we consider the case of a journalist named Wu Changping, won a prize for transparency and who in this video, as you can see, speaks that nature of the blurred and murky side of Chinese politics. This Wu Changping was awarded, as I said, with a prize, but he was recently criticized for his criticism of a main melody film on the Korean War produced for release in 2020. As early as October 2021, he'd been taken into custody for his online criticism and berated in the press as someone who had the hubris to dare to express himself openly, 敢言, even when, as we now know, such criticism was provided for in the system as preserved in cultural memory, 言路, the openness of that speech. Now, creating, as I said, in this film made about him, he's actually speaking about murkiness and how it's necessary to make this transparent. I will skip this. Creating transparency, keeping the path of speech open in the sense of the ideal ruler actually meant listening to precisely those critical voices who 敢言, dare to speak. And an ideal ruler would not only want in the sense of one supposedly correct history to talk to and to change those below. To the contrary, the ideal ruler was one who always felt obliged to those who inside the system, as so-called pure officials, as you can see here, or outside the system as the people who were allowed to criticize with songs and so on and so forth from below, daring to speak, to point to new paths, alternatives. If a ruler did not do this, then it was to speak with Mao Zedong. You will see how this classical dictatus actually extends right into the government circles. He had the right to rebel, 造反有力, right, which is a Maoist approach. So Mao himself is kind of saying we must produce wild stories, because in such a case, if such wild stories are being produced, this is a sign that the ruler had fulfilled his mandate. But not all rulers cared about these classical ideas. Mao Zedong, right? He was the example of the anti-rightist campaign that we talked about earlier, and that followed the 100 Flowers criticism is a good example for this. Even in imperial times, of course, this pure official would usually have brought his very own coffin to the handing over of his remonstration letter. The remonstration would be called Shen Ye, or it will be called Shangshu. It's the letter above, or a letter that remonstrates with the ruler. And usually, if not torture or death, exile was the least one had to expect, and not unlike the friend in the villas knew, right, in this poem that comes with the piece by Zhou Wenzhong. They all were kind of expecting this when they were doing this kind of criticism, and of course the most popular of these clear, pure officials is Zhiyi, as you can see, is commemorated every year in one day at the Dragon Boat Festival. This is and not just recently, but throughout the long 20th century, that one could call the socialist modern, the gesture of remonstrance too, in the sense of Zhiyi, was practiced or evoked. They claim to be committed to openness, the openness of the classically guaranteed so-called way of speech, the Yanlu, which a good ruler had to keep open. The authors of such writings take the position, basically, of the good old pure official, the officially established censor or remonstrator. And so you would have, and I just run you through, Defense Minister Peng Dehuai writing a 10,000 character Shangshu letter to the above, and that is, of course, his criticism of the Great Leap in 1959. In turn, you have Wu Han, who writes, alludes to this act of Peng Dehuai, who is immediately, of course, dismissed. He alludes to this act of Peng Dehuai in a 1961 historical drama called Hai Wei Ba Wan. Hai Wei, this list from Office Hai Wei is, again, sort of in history, a Qiguan, a pure official, and this story sort of becomes the story of Peng Dehuai. It also becomes the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, and it becomes, of course, the reason why Wu Han actually is criticized and then basically put an end. His life is put to end. But I mean, I want to just briefly show you how. Possibly deliver to his emperor this letter of criticism that he wants to deliver, right? The criticism of this opera and the remonstrance of Hai Wei, and thus implicitly the rehabilitation of the ruler, here Mao Zedong, becomes one of the first acts of the Cultural Revolution. So even in a period where Chinese traditions were generally suppressed, that is during the Maoist era, Sinophone Classicism, you could say, is practiced for good effect, and I would argue that this is all done throughout Mao's lifetime, but then also beyond. With the beginning of the reform period now, we have, after Mao's death, at the wall of democracy, Wei Jingsheng, who, among others, called for the fifth modernization democracy in a memorandum of 1979 in the form of a Dazibao, a big character poster, as once endorsed as a just and good form of remonstration by Mao himself at the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. Mao says, write Dazibao. We'll show you the quote later when he was saying this. And in a similar way, the demonstrators on Tiananmen Square in 1989 knelt down, demonstrating in front of the Great Hall of the people and packaged their demands once again as a remonstrated letter to the top. Not surprisingly, you know the fates of all of these remonstrators. Waiting, Sheng goes into prison, and these guys are getting killed on Tiananmen Square itself. And not surprisingly, a lawyer such as Xu Zhangrong, who in July 2018, with a detailed online critique against Xi Jinping, which is titled Our Fears and Hopes, revisits the great tradition of the remonstration, is punished like most of those who'd written remonstrations before in earlier years. In 2019, he's demoted from Tsinghua University, banned from teaching, writing, and publishing, and so on. China's intellectuals, China's artists, China's citizens, however, will not be silenced. They continue to speak. They sing, they write poetry. They might do so silently, but not really all that. Again and again, we see how anger conquers fear, as you can see in these titles. Some of these furious citizens who no longer fear. This is the title of a new open remonstration letter that Xi Jinping that Xu Zhangrong publishes on 4th of February 2020, so right in the COVID crisis. And in this essay, he warns, as does another lawyer, Xu Zhiyong, that you can see here, who's actually writing a remonstration letter where he says, step down, Xi Jinping. They're warning of the dangers of one-man rule, sycophantic bureaucracy, and a host of other problems that threaten the system if it refuses further reforms. They do so. Here is Xu Zhiyong, who sort of says your dream is really a fake dream, and they do so by again drawing on classical examples. So here you have Xu Zhangrong, who actually evokes this poem by a great poem, a 9th century poem, in which you can see on the left-hand side where the splendor of the palace is described in many great sort of details, fluttering dancers' sleeves, and then on the right-hand side you have the suffering people, and you can see in blue or turquoise how the music in the palace is noisy. Right, noisier than patter in the market, the people, however, have been basically gagged. And after all, the folk of all under heaven cannot voice their rage, but they dare to be angry. After all, when the heart and mind of the one man, that is the ruler, grows ever more arrogant and proud, the folk of all under heaven cannot voice their rage. In fact, it means they dare not speak, but they dare to be angry. So they are silenced after all, but they still will be very, very angry. And therefore, no matter how hard the government tries to silence important voices, no matter how often people lose their voice in the face of repression, they won't lose their voice. They will always dare to speak. That's what these people are saying. And indeed, they dare to speak. The old man from Shanghai who shouted out his anger about the April 2022 lockdown to the world is very telling in this regard. What he's howling out is a truly wild story in which he points to parallels between parts in Chinese history, the Cultural Revolution. You can see there, for example, that are carefully left out of the last sort of official history, the resolutions on history from 1945, 81 to 2021. And he really is shouting out a wild history, a story of protest. He brings to bear the relevance of such moments of oppression, such as the Cultural Revolutionist trauma in the present. And he ends all things. At the end, you see that statement that he would actually like, I'm going to apply to be put in jail. He would like to be in prison, because at least in prison, you can get and he wants to lie low to tangping, which is usually what the use is. It's a youth expression, but this old man is actually using it. And just here.
在树上爬，鸟在飞呀、他们口罩戴了吗？他们的传播力比我们还强呢。先解决这个问题啊！麻雀到处飞呀、那我们小区都不出门了，整天闷在监狱里呀、
So the Chinese have repeatedly expressed their indignation, having their indignation having sealed, as you can see here from Hong, forbidden to speak, etc., etc. Silence, 监口, even having their mouth shut and not put into their tongue. And you can see there's the caricatures from the early 20th century. These expressions are expressions that go back much further in time. And then, of course, people will remember the contribution, especially with this last expression, to shut someone's mouth and put a knot through the tongue, with Zhang Zhiyi, who was silenced before or while he was being executed, because even during her execution, she would be shouting out her criticism, and so they cut off the tongue. This sculpture by Wang Keping was the title Chen Ye, sinking into silence. It uses exactly the term that Lu Xun chooses for the dangerous, intense, dark, and explosive silence of rage, not the term Jingmo that is being used in the by. Sorry. So he uses the term Chen Ye here, and he doesn't use that term Jingmo that the government is using for the lockdowns, right? So Wang Keping's statue is one where you can see how people are being gagged, but at the same time you can also see how explosive this statue is, and I think it's not a coincidence that it does remind one of the shriek by Luke. But can one still scream at all? Or must every such cry remain stuck in the throat? In Hong Kong, even in 2020, June 4th, with the brutal end to the Tiananmen protests, was commemorated. Today, all of those who had called for the memorial in spite of corona bans are behind bars. No further commemoration has taken place since then, officially at least. There is silence, but in this silence, as you can see here, there is rage. On June 4th, 2023, a young woman was photographed sitting on a park bench in Hong Kong, defying the security personnel standing right next to her and leafing through a booklet, which on its cover is inscribed May 35th, for way of remembering June 4th. It's easier to dam a river than to silence the people. In June 2019, on the 30th anniversary of the crackdown in Tiananmen Square, protesters against the extradition law joined forces with participants in the commemorative events. Here, once again, meaningful sounds of silence were evoked. One of the soundtracks taken from the context of the demonstration into the commemoration was taken from Les Misérables, and it's à la volonté du peuple, which in English is, do you hear the people sing? And there are some new lyrics now to this song that were being performed in 2019. These new lyrics, sung in Cantonese, the language of the Hong Kongers, but not of the regime from the People's Republic of China, are in this performance sung quite differently than in the militant original during the demonstration. The urgency of the matter comes through all the more clearly with the quiet darkness, the candlelight that you will see in a minute. Who has not yet raised his voice? The text asks. Who will put up with silence? Who is still not awake and listening to the freedom that is playing with? Impatience speaks from these lyrics. Why is our beautiful dream still a dream? And who wants to endure being silenced? Didn't to speak. Above all, no one has the right to silence, to make us sink in silence. And here we're back to the use of Chen Ye that Lu Xun uses and that Wang Keping uses for his statue. The text ends, hopeful, we're human beings. We have the responsibility of freedom to determine.
試問誰還未發聲，都寫我企，誰為我成？天生有權，還有心可作主，誰要認命噤聲？試問誰能未覺醒？聽真那自由在奏鳴，激起在難違背的那份良知和應。為何美夢仍是個夢幻想，等人是泡影？為這黑與白，這非與是，真與偽來做證。為這世代有未來，要及時擦亮眼睛。試問誰還未發聲？都寫我企，誰為我成？天生有權，還有心可作主，誰要認命噤聲？
Moves into the same soundtrack.
Singing the song of angry men, this is the music of the people who will not be slaves again. When the beating of...
So the dream is evoked here again and again as a leitmotif and elsewhere. You may remember Shen's dream, right? And of course, you remember Xi Jinping's dream that is basically the lie. And then there is many others who evoke this. Han Song never publishes My Nation Does Not Dream. Pato Yan, an incredible playwright who was poet or dramatist in residence at the Mannheim National Theatre for last year, has written a very, very interesting concise history of future in which he speaks of a dream. There is a character called the sinister girl who keeps on saying to her lover, it's not real, I don't believe it's real, it's only a dream, but what she's really speaking about is very, very real. It is the China that Xu Zhiyong is talking about, the China that Xi Jinping has created, and so that dream is a very real dream. The butterfly, of course, that in another piece by Han Yen, The Damned and the Saved, that he co-produced, it's an opera with Ma Lingbong. There comes up the butterfly again as sort of the motif of the dream that in the Zhuangzian dream already is so very, very important. That you have here two characters who are basically revolutionaries, and they are being tortured in a torture cell, and all they can hear from one from another is that they're actually talking about this butterfly, and one of the characters, the real revolutionary, starts to collect the dreams of the people, and those dreams of the people that she collects, nobody's speaking about them, she just collects them. They become the cancer that then later basically topples the system. And so the dreams actually become the power with which a bad system can actually be toppled. Now, a Chinese says that all troubles come from the mouth. It is there, and increasingly so, under the iron hand of Xi Jinping, the fear, not only of the ruler or the people, but especially of the people, the ruler. And accordingly, it has become quieter in recent years, not only in Hong Kong. Wu Xun, whom I have quoted again and again, has another quote where he speaks about silence, and again he uses that word chen. He says that basically in 1926 he says it warns of the absolute and dead silence of a dying race and calls out chen mo, silence, oh silence. If we do not explode in it, we will perish in it. In the face of such predictions, it is encouraging to see that 100 years later, the students at Peking University, who in April 2022 resisted the lockdown of their university, not only sang Pink Floyd, Another Brick in the Wall, as they dismantled the barricades. We don't need no education, right? We don't need no thought control. But also, very quietly, that song from Les Miserables, Do You Hear the People Sing? Which refers, of course, back to demonstrators in Hong Kong. And the title of the composition by Shen Ye, with which Zhiyi introduced me, and that I will close with, Leute, könnt hören? Guys, can you hear this? Or do you hear the people sing? This title, of course, also evokes from this. His composition incorporates song texts from all over the world and from the most diverse times, in moving in the direction of a Sinophone Classicism that is, in fact, a global classicism, as Zhiyi says. His texts range from the Bible to the Sumerian drinking songs to quotes from Putin, as you can see here. The composition is written from the perspective and position of the lockdown, euphemistically called Qingmo, right? Still or dead silence, which, however, is not maybe, or is perhaps actually a Chenmo, and deep, explosive silence. And so you can see how the circle is coming to a closure and how I'm really coming to the end. His piece, the piece by Shen Ye, evokes by an illusion to dangerous silence just before the explosion, Chen, that Lu Xun observes and that Du Mu also describes, the angry, potentially angry silence of the oppressed, the silence that remonstrates, the silence that accuses. And he uses very interesting voices. For example, the voice of Jesus, right, who says, Vater, willst du, so nehme diesen Kelch von mir. Nicht mein, sondern dein Wille geschehe. And he uses that in a direct, in a passage where he uses other clear accusations of wrong, basically denunciations and so forth. Uses that right next to, as I said, a text. So the composition by Shen Ye, not unlike that of Zhong and Zhong, which I began, is obviously written in the tradition of silent songs that can express, by not speaking them, spelling them out, free and angry dreams. It is no coincidence that Shen combines a very quiet text from the Diamond Sutra with the Zhou text immediately after this dramatic scene that I just showed you. And again, there it is the dream that becomes sort of the main and important element. And I think that, again, is not by coincidence. Shen's composition, not unlike the one by Zhong that we started with, is obviously written in the tradition, silent songs that can express, by not speaking, by not spelling them out, free and angry dreams. Ideally, this tradition has allowed criticism of the ruling system, legitimate, if not always legitimized, protest for millennia in China. That is classicism at best. Courageous artists, intellectuals, journalists, but also ordinary people, like our Shanghai range citizens, and not least the many wordless demonstrators with their blank sheets, tirelessly embrace this Sinophone Classicism. In the process, texts and sounds from the most diverse traditions are brought into this Chinese semantic context of the rage silence, which Mao Zedong also once called for when, in 1958, he spoke of the blank sheets with which, once again, the demonstrators were so successful last November. So now you understand what had happened in 2022. The silence of the blank sheet that stands for no words, as every ruler in China knows, is potentially explosive. In Mao's own phrase, on a blank sheet of paper free from any mark, the freshest and most beautiful characters can be written. Is basically the freshest and most beautiful pictures can be painted, is basically an explanation. It's been often quoted actually in the journalistic articles on this, but it hasn't actually been explained. So what Mao says, well, why is this so? He says, first, poor, and second, blank. This is poverty makes people revolutionary. Poverty makes people write about big character posters. Poverty makes them speak up. And he says that by quoting another poem that speaks of silencing and unsilence. And that poem, only in wind and thunder can the country show its vitality. Alas, the 10,000 horses are all silenced. Right? The one ma Zhiyi就可爱. Oh heaven, bestir yourself, I beseech you, and send down the megaphone. He concludes that the power of Dazibao, of these sheets of paper that you can write, the blank paper that you can write, will defeat the silence of the 10,000 horses. He certainly knew of the dangerous power of silence. Notice the date, 1958, only a few months before sort of 1959, the Great Leap Forward, only a few months after the 1957 anti-racist movement. And I end with Shanghai composer Shen Ye, who ends his composition with the words, "You've heard our song. Will you remember our story?" On the 2nd of December 2022, China completely lifts the COVID restrictions from one day to the next. The silent songs, the wild narratives, unspoken dreams that lay behind soundless rustling of the blank sheets had become threatening enough. It's easier to dam a river than to silence the people. Thank you very much.